that everybody has been enjoying a very fruitful session over the last few hours, and we're going to finalize our sessions of this morning, afternoon, evening, or good night, wherever you are, with a award presentation on behalf of the ISEE. We're awarding Rashid Hassan, who is a long-term member of the Society of Ecological Economics, and has been very active in work in training and in research on development and agriculture in Africa. I want to just talk very briefly about the Boulding Award. This is the Kenneth E. Boulding Memorial Award that was established by the ISEE about 20 years ago. Kenneth Boulding was a leading systems thinker and who integrated social theory with the natural sciences and moral philosophy. He was an eccentric, provocative critic of the fragmentation that characterized modern scholarship. Yet his creativity, seminal ideas, and constructive engagement with the scientific community were widely recognized, resulting in his having been elected to the presidency of the American Economics Association and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Kenneth and his wife Elise, herself a renowned sociologist, were Quakers who actively contributed to the international peace movement. Kenneth lived humbly with grace, wit, and laughter, and maintained unbounded faith that goodness and sensibility would ultimately prevail in a world that is now seriously threatened by human folly. This award is given on a biennial basis. Usually we would be in our biennial conference, but we are going to have that next year. So we'll have another talk by Rashid at that time, we hope. But we're giving the award now and in honor of people who exemplify the aspects of the special character that Kenneth Boulding brought, with the hope that we perpetuate his many individual strengths combined into wisdom among ISEE members and beyond. The 20 awardees to date included in 1994, Robert Goodland, Herman Daly; 96, Anne-Marie Jansen, Robert Costanza in 98, C.S. Holling in 2000, Bob Ayers in 2002, Carl Goran Mahler and Partha Dasgupta shared an award in 2004, Dick Norgard in 2006, Manfred Bex-Neef and Charles Perrings in 2008, and Joan Martin-Zalier and Ignacy Sachs in 2010, Bill Rees and Mathis Wakernagel for the global ecological footprint analysis in 2012, Peter Victor in 2014, Kanchan Chopra and Aral Devatin shared an award in 2016, and Inga Ropke just received 2 years ago in Mexico. And Rashid is now with us. And Rashid is a really fascinating guy. He was born in Sudan, and he's now returned to Sudan, where he's speaking from Khartoum today. He's now the Secretary General of the Higher Council for the Environment and Natural Resources of the government of Sudan, while he continues as an emeritus professor at the University of Pretoria, where he's been teaching for the past 20 years or so. Before that, he worked for CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in East Africa, and at the University of Juba in Sudan before that. He's been honored to just last year as an international member of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, which is a very, very high honor since there are so few international members who are participating in the AAAS. Rashid has also been on scientific policy advisory committees such as the GAF, STAP, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the UN Committee for Development Policy, the CGIAR Science Council, high-level panel of experts on food security and climate change, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and many other important international academies and so on. He's been a chief editor of the African Journal of Agricultural Resource Economics and has worked significantly on water accounting and management in South Africa, where he has been able to chart the efficiency of use of water, which he's been doing together with our friend Glenn Marie Lang. So we've been friends for a long time, and it's really great to welcome Rashid and to celebrate his award. I want to also thank Madhu Verma, who is with us as a co-manager of this session, and she will be fielding questions from the gathered community, or two communities, if you want to call them that, of degrowth and ecological economics to our meeting today. So Rashid, can you go right to your presentation?
Good evening, everybody. Peter, thank you very much for the introduction and your kind words, and I'm very grateful and highly appreciate the honor awarded by the association. I'm very grateful and thankful to the committee. I'm honored to be to join this group of distinguished colleagues, and I hope that I will live to the demands of joining that group. It is certainly a very great pleasure for me to speak to you today. Let me share my slides. And I will be talking about what challenges are facing Sub-Saharan Africa post COVID-19 and what kinds of options are there for Africa to go into a green recovery. I do consider my talk to be more of framing issues rather than a research investigation. And I'm just going to do an introduction. In the introduction, I wanted the introduction to serve the purpose of defining some of the main features of the context and the problem of COVID and its impacts and dynamics. And I wanted to compare the pandemic with global warming because I think it's going to be useful to define some of the features that have implications, especially for the context and the types of response measures and policies that are facing Africa. And then I want to link that to the context and talk about what is the status. And there are going to be around four main challenges characterizing the situation post-COVID in Sub-Saharan Africa. The one will be looking at the challenge of having the problem, the origin of the problem being related to managing the wild and the commons. And then I will speak about other structural features of the Sub-Saharan African economies and ecosystems that make them vulnerable, and that's mainly the size of the informal sector and informal activities in these economies. Then I will also talk about the implications of having very big inequalities and the implication of that for the distribution of impact of the pandemic. And then, of course, I will also touch on what we are all doing right now, and with the digital, testing the digital medium to communicate. And I think the whole world has been doing that for the last few months. And then I will end with giving you an idea or a quick tour on what Africa is thinking about in terms of the green recovery strategy. The comparison I want to make that will help us, frame the questions between global warming and the pandemic is that both of them, COVID has also been sent a very powerful message, awakening the world with respect to how dangerous and how serious is it to cross the limits of the natural capacity of the natural world, and of course, on life on Earth, and that has forced, just like climate change, some balancing adjustments. And of course, it has one of the benefits, I would say, of course, in spite of all the pains and the high price that people paid in terms of people's life. But it has really raised the awareness of the world about how important is it to preserve the natural balances and operate within the limits, of the natural world and functioning of the natural systems, to be able to prevent emergence of similar pandemics in the future. And another similarity is that that both of them are linked to, the type of typical institutional failures, market failures. The absence of an institution that is capable of internalizing the consequences of actions by individuals, whether they're private individuals, in terms of the consumption with respect to the greenhouse emissions, or interfering with the functioning of natural life support systems like biodiversity. The global warming has overlaid the capacity of the atmospheric ecosystems in terms of as a regulating sink service, and then at the same time, similarly, the interference with the balances of the natural system and the encroaching on the natural habitat of wildlife has also disrupted the functional integrity of the system, and also have the common feature of that they start or they originate from acts and actions and decisions of individuals in terms of private consumption, or in the case of COVID, there is a communal aspect of this in terms of dealing with and managing the commons at the local level, but then they become global problems and they become a global common problem. So they both also share that, and then because of that, dealing with them needs coordination. There are actions and choices to be made globally, and at the same time to coordinate that with national level types of strategies and responses. But they are different in many ways that are important for the context and the types of responses and policy choices that are available and needed to deal with this. The first difference is that the source of the problem is a little bit of a different nature, which makes the target of the interventions to influence the desired change are different. For instance, in the case of global warming, the problem is related to the emissions of greenhouse gases, and but the nature of the problem is relatively, I wouldn't say easier, but relatively clear, because the source of the emissions, the origin of the problem, is in more formal, organized sectors of economic activity, sort of mainly integrated in the economic system, which is a little bit different from the pandemic. And so in that case, the policy measures that we need to deal and address global warming and climate change probably relatively clear because of the more formally organized kinds of sectors that source of this problem. And of course, our objects of intervention and that we want to influence relatively are easy to target. Unlike the COVID pandemic, it's linked to the interference with the natural world. The the numbers tell us that 60% of the infections, human infections, that come from contact with animals, animal origin, and they are typically associated with interfering with and mismanagement of commons. And so the system, the targets, and the functioning, the governance system is a little bit more complex in terms in the case of COVID compared to the source of the emissions in the global warming that come from organized, formal sectors of economic activity. And in the case of the pandemic, you can see that the types of policies and actions that are optimal and appropriate, they are a little bit relatively more complicated and subtle to do. And you can say it's a more industrialized urban context type of a problem, the emissions of greenhouse gases, not 100%, but compared to the pandemic. the source more related and the origin more related to more underdeveloped rural context. So the context is different because of the source and the type of the nature of the problem. Another difference that is important is that the nature of the dynamics, how the problems unfold. The global warming is relatively slower and it unfolds over time, whereas the pandemic, just like other disasters, it hits immediately and have immediate direct impacts, and it is fast spreading. And so it requires in response quick responses to save lives. And unlike we have taken so many years, we're still struggling to try and design the policies and measures that we need to address climate change. But in the case of COVID, we need to quickly have measures. And the other difference is that, like as I said, like disasters, the duration is a little bit different. We still, it doesn't take as long, but we're not sure. It has a chance of recurrence, and we're not sure when. There's a very high uncertainty about the future of the pandemic. And of course, then because of that, the response strategies and policy measures are different. As I said, we in the case of the pandemic, the world needs very quick, emergency kinds of actions and contain the spreading of the virus, lockdowns, social distancing, and vaccines, and all those things. And so that can tell us that especially in the case of the context of sub-Saharan Africa, which we're going to turn to those, there are major sources of vulnerability, and where the burden of the impact falls. The issues that the experiences that we had in dealing with COVID has really exposed how serious inequities and inequality are in terms of accessing emergency health services, and how difficult to have social distancing work in certain circumstances where the conditions and the circumstances have crowded housing, residential neighborhoods, transport facilities, schools, and shopping centers. So we have seen that it has affected, the proportion has been much bigger, falling on certain vulnerable groups and disadvantaged groups. And then, of course, we have the issue in addition to the short-term and quick responses to contain the pandemic spread and save lives. There is a challenge of looking at the longer-term, more medium-term, longer-term responses and strategies to, in face of uncertain future about what will happen. Now, I'm just going to take you and give you an overview about the challenges and the vulnerabilities that characterize the main features of those for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, because the source of the origin of the problem comes from contact with between human and animal, and mainly, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, the hunting from the wild is, and for bushmeat and for commercial purposes, is really very significant. And the numbers, we can look at the numbers. The numbers are very telling, and mainly for around local commons where we have protected areas and conservation places where are designated for protection of biodiversity and wildlife. So it's recent statistics from FAO and other organizations show that about 60% of the population in Africa, are talking about more than 600 million people, are food insecure, and so they are, because of that, they are highly reliant on hunting from the wild. In the Congo Basin, they are talking about close to 5 million tons of bushmeat confiscated annually. Central Africa, game hunting up to 80%, 80 to 98% of people in Cameroon on dependent bushmeat. In South Africa, similar patterns. Kenya also shows a very high dependence and reliance on bushmeat, and similarly rural Botswana. So the picture in terms of the vulnerability because of the high reliance and dependence on hunting from the wild for bushmeat and for subsistence is a major factor that need to be dealt with, because that makes the contact with the source of the virus very problematic. And another feature that the bushmeat activities are noticed to be around really more serious in areas where we have protected areas designated for conservation, and also the statistics show you that that's where we have a major problem. And so these are vulnerabilities in terms of dealing with the pandemic. They are, you can see, they are slightly different from the case of the global warming and climate change. Another issue is that bushmeat is not only exploited for subsistence by these communities, they are also exploited for commercial purposes. There is a significant trade in wildlife meat and products, and so this is another big problem, and the numbers will tell you, show you that they are widespread in Africa and high. So that's another thing to manage, and they have implications in terms of the conservation of wildlife policies. Of course, measures that will, maybe dealing with trade in wildlife products and bushmeat and stuff like this. There are a number of policies and measures that they are in place, and there are agreements and protocols in terms of trade. But I think, in my opinion, the most difficult one is managing the interaction of these communities, local communities, with the local commons in terms of hunting of wildlife for subsistence. And there are a number of initiatives, and some countries have taken measures to ban some of these practices, but it's a very difficult context. It's something different than having a levy on fuels and fossil fuels, or in terms of dealing with emissions, especially the managing the commons where you have communities around them having direct access, and there are different governance systems, and interventions and interference there for policies is a bit difficult. The other thing is the immediate and quick response of lockdown, and has caused, there are reports that it has caused loss of employment opportunities and restriction on labor movement. Now, in certain circumstances, like in many parts of arid Africa, that there are reports that has increased, illegal game hunting. Labor sharing has also affected a number of, fundamental practices in those contexts, where labor sharing is a practice for pasture surveillance, for guarding of livestock, and so not only the origin of the problem is problematic to deal with, but the responses like lockdowns have also implications, and so tourism is a major industry in sub-Saharan Africa. It's been seriously affected, and there are reports that has led to increases in game hunting. One other I would call structural vulnerability is the fact that, and that creates problems and makes it difficult in terms of the response strategies and policy choices, is the significance and the magnitude of the people involved in the informal sector activities. In general, in developing countries, the informal sector accounts for about up to 65% of the GDP, but in Africa, 90% of the African labor is the African labor force is employed in the, or earn a living, and their livelihoods depend on activities in the informal sector. So that's a big challenge. Why? Because it is difficult. The types of measures and policy responses that are, for instance, like stay-at-home measures and social distancing, are not very easy to comply with in these circumstances. If you have huge numbers of people living on selling small products on the streets, like vendors, small retail shops and restaurants on the streets, and so it has been a big challenge for most governments to really enforce these kinds of measures, like especially social distancing. And so, the big challenge here in terms of policy and strategies for the green recovery is to make progress in terms of integrating informal activities in an organized spheres of economic activity, and that's not an easy thing to do. And or creating employment. One option is to create employment opportunities outside agriculture, but in rural areas still will have to be agro-based, and there are big challenges there. But those are some strategic choices to now. As I said, the burden has been has fallen on primarily. I think we have seen that in the north. We have seen that in the south. Disadvantaged communities, the poor, and so the higher the inequality, the bigger the problem that at hand and the options to deal with. This is a typical characteristic and one major feature in the African, sub-Saharan African context. Maybe the one difference between from Asia is that density of population, which was a factor probably in Brazil and India, is not as bad. But then people are living the living conditions, the housing conditions are miserable. They are crowded. The public transport systems and networks are also make it difficult. They have poor access to health services, especially emergency medical services, and so addressing inequality is another challenge and a big vulnerability for sub-Saharan Africa to deal with. And a major challenge for achieving sustainable development goals and leaving no one behind, as they say. Now, the other one that the last that I want to talk to you is what, as I said earlier, what we are doing now, all of us, testing the capacity and the ability of digital platform to really allow us to do business. So there is a trend in becoming inevitable, and it seems like it is going to be the direction that we are going to be doing business, we are going to be doing learning and schooling and services provision and all that online. Now, again, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is very disadvantaged, seriously disadvantaged in the capacity to cope with this and join the rest of the world. I know right now in many countries in Sudan here, for the last 6 months, they have not been able, and I know compared to other countries, some in Africa have been able to do online schooling from a distance. It's been difficult. The price is huge, yes, the social and economic price in terms of losing one academic year for learners. Doing business has not been easy through online. And so those are very big challenges. If you think that 88% of people in sub-Saharan Africa are without internet connections, and the statistics show that sub-Saharan Africa has the least ability to switch to telework, to continue business and doing other things. So there are big challenges with respect to this digital transformation, high literacy, digital literacy, very expensive, high cost ICT infrastructure, limited electricity supply, basically, a number of very major structural constraints. Some countries have attempted, but it is a very limiting factor. And so investing in building adequate digital infrastructure and have access for as many people as possible are going to be very important for all effort that we need for biodiversity conservation. I would like to end by just giving you an idea about what kind of initiatives and thinking that's happening in Africa. There is one institution that's called the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, and they have what they call Africa's Green Stimulus Program. Now, it has a number of things dealing with all kinds of environmental challenges and issues, but there is a very important emphasis on biodiversity conservation. And I'm not sure how we're doing with time. I think we are, but you can take a look. These are actually, you will find them. You can find them on the web. But they, you can see that some of the elements here mainly, deal with the types of responses and strategies that Sub-Saharan Africa needs to address, protection of biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity, and management of the interaction of communities with natural habitats, at urban as well as in rural areas, especially dealing with illegal and unregulated wildlife exploitation and trade. But I think the most difficult one is going to be managing the cohabitation at the local level between communities that are still very highly dependent on the wild. And Peter, I want to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashid. I really appreciate your work on preparing for this discussion. I don't see any questions on the chat. I don't know what happened, but I'm particularly interested in. There's one thing that you didn't mention when you were talking about the contrast between global warming issues and COVID, is that a lot, at least in where I come from in Brazil, there is a lot of concern for deforestation and agricultural expansion into areas which are considered to be ripe for development from certain sectors of the economy. And that is also considered to be a considerable source of vulnerability for the exposure to eventual pandemic infection that may be occurring. It's already occurring in the inverse way, also with the indigenous population of the Amazon. So I'm wondering to what extent. I mean, this is related also very strongly to the emissions of CO2 that occur in some countries in Africa as well. I'm just wondering to what extent, I mean, you're dividing things pretty clearly against sort of the urban industrial sector, which is emitting greenhouse gases, and the rural sector, which is just exploiting bushmeat. But I think that there are other places where there are interfaces that need to be dealt with. I think that the studies that we just reviewed in that paper that I sent you recently, where we're looking at the principal sources of incursion that are resulting in COVID exposure, not in pandemic causing zoonoses, have been found to be agriculture expansion, deforestation, and so on. Whereas bushmeat exposure may be significant in Africa particularly, and some in Southeast Asia, but most of the world no. So I think that there are important contrasts that have to be drawn between different parts of the world, and I think Africa is very unique in the role of bushmeat as a source of rural protein, and the exposure that is brought about by that to various zoonoses like AIDS and the SARS and other things that have popped up lately. So I'm just wondering, we do.
Yeah, sure. May
I think we now have something from Walter Penge that I'm going to pass to you. The problem is that COVID did not stop demands on land. Deforestation is a real issue under the pandemic as a result of weak controls in land. The case of Argentina, north and mid expansion is happening now. Greenhouse and deforestation in the south is currently being studied, and fires, you can see the maps today, are a real and worrying issue. So he's repeating a little bit what I was talking about. So go ahead and respond.
Well, thanks. I am in full agreement with that. I think the same that is happening to the Amazon. Land use is really, change of land use is really a major factor. Deforestation, definitely, and it's happening in Africa, especially Central Africa, where there is the biggest natural forest there and in other parts of Africa, and particularly expansion of, yeah, but it is, you know, the difference there is not really just that. It is the action of organized economic sectors. Again, the expansion of agriculture and land use is coming, the encroachment is coming. This is the subtle difference. It's not coming from communities. It's coming from organized agriculture. And in Africa, actually, the land grabbing is the biggest problem that, you know, mainly multilateral companies, you know, land grabs, huge chunks of land have been converted to different types of uses, and of course, causing all the problems. But also, communities contribute to deforestation as well. So I agree with you that land use, change in land use is a big problem, and I also agree with the comment. I think they're the same comment. The demand for land and deforestation are major factors. But you know that, you know, if the encroachment is coming from an organized economic activity, what I wanted to say is the target of the intervention is slightly easier. I don't say it is very easy, but the measures probably are a little bit. So, you know, it is easy to intervene and restrict, and have policies to restrict these expansions. And you know, unlike the governance regimes, in the case of the interaction between local communities and their local environment, is a little bit more complex.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there, I think that goes right to Richard Falvey's point here. He says he was very shocked with the 60% food insecurity. How can it be addressed and so reduce the incursion into wild zones? So food insecurity in general is a question. How do you cope with that in terms of finding substitutes or ranching, game ranching? What other options are there?
Well, I think the agriculture transformation strategies for Africa and other parts of the world, particularly Africa. Of course, you know, the aiming at reducing the expansion at the horizon, as they say, and increasing the, you know, having the vertical expansion, increasing productivity. Of course, the gains, the margins of the gains from productivity have become very small. And there is still pressure on land, converting land for, you know, to meet food demands. But I think there are a number of other dynamics that are taking place in Africa that's even probably, and as you know, I agree. I mean, that's a challenge. The food security issue is a challenge, how to meet. And at the same time, there is a, you know, expansion of population, not only in urban areas. There is very huge and fast urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa, which brings other types of challenges as well. Because these are people who have been producing their food before from their backyard and self-sufficient to some extent. They are moving to be urban settlers, and you need to produce food from, you know, from by someone else, and bring that food to the urban centers where they. So there are important challenges there also to deal with urbanization. But the numbers also show that the rural population is also increasing. It's not only urbanization. There is a growth still in rural population in Africa. But yeah, I'm not saying global warming is simpler, but there are very complex issues.
There's another question here from Walter on promoting different means of rural production that could be a possibility for overcoming some of these problems. You wonder with the to what extent there's an engagement with agroecology and for socioeconomic benefit. Is there a promotion of agroecology for food at the local level in Africa, or is this something that we're only seeing in very small niches?
Yeah. There are a number of agriculture research centers, the International Agriculture Research Center, the CGR, like ICRA, for instance. They are trying technologies like this. They're trying agroforestry and intercropping with leguminous crops. They're calling them the neglected or the small, crops, the beans, and they are very important in the diet, the African. But then there are efforts to try to improve on their productivity and provide incentives for farmers, especially small-scale farmers, to intercrop instead of having these monocropping systems of maize and sorghum and things like that, to intercrop with legumes and trees. There are attempts like that. I think there are a number of types of interventions, technological and institutional and policy, economic policy ones that are being promoted to address the food security issue. There is a problem of also the diet transition, which is a major problem with urbanization. That people are switching increasingly to, of course, increase the share of animal protein. Now that has big impact on climate change and emissions, especially from livestock. So extensive livestock rearing is also where there's more contact with animals, directly with communities, but it also has implications, changing the options to change to intensive. That is a trend now, intensive livestock feeding. And it has, as you said, it has connections to both climate change and emissions, and at the same time, more contact with livestock. So there are a number of trade-offs and challenges. There are a number of major trends that are important, that are drivers of change, like rapid and high urbanization. In the next 10 years, 20 years, it's expected that probably 60-70% of the urbanization in the world is going to happen in Africa. So the problem is very complicated.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, listen, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you one last question about your current role in the government of Sudan. What kinds of things are you coping with, and how easy or difficult has it been to address environmental and sustainability issues in Sudan from the position that you're taking?
After 30 years of a non-democratic system where you have total authority to do whatever you want to do, a big mess. Pollution. The way they have extracted minerals, oil, rushing after all those things, the curse of the oil rich, the curse of the mineral rich, we are dealing with huge amounts of pollution, mismanagement, and exploitation of natural resources, and wasting of wealth on consumption, basically. So we're dealing with all kinds of problems in rural areas where you have the mining industry, the oil industry, in urban circumstances. So there are huge environmental mismanagement problems that we are dealing with. But the biggest thing is, establishing institutional reforms is what we are having a priority now, building capacity in the institution and the governance system to have increase the, empowerment and participation of communities and stakeholders. So there is a lot of work to be done. It's huge.
Okay, we just have a couple of more questions before we were supposed to finish. Madhu has a question on migration. Are there issues like turnover migration to rural areas, or people returning to rural areas? You mentioned that the population is increasing there also, which is usually the other trend. And you talk about urbanization being the major process in Africa. What measures would you suggest to engage the people who are going back into rural areas in various jobs, specifically green jobs, which should promote nature-based solutions to the current problem?
Okay. Well, I mean, in general, in Africa, one big problem is still is not really it is political instability. That is a major cause of displacement of big numbers of population, in particularly in Sudan, civil war. We were talking about millions of people displaced, and now they have just signed a peace agreement yesterday, and resettling all these millions is a big challenge. But it is to some extent general in Africa. But I think there are, a number of other, I mean, people who are working in agriculture transformation dealing with a number of other structural features in the transformation that happened in Africa. There is record of an improved productivity in spite of all these problems. Agriculture productivity and yields and stuff, there are gains. Now, the problem is, the classical model of development that, labor released from agriculture with development are absorbed in the industrial sectors and modern sectors. One feature that's happening in Africa that most of this labor is not absorbed in the modern industrial sector, they are absorbed in the informal sector. And that's a major problem, and especially with, as we said, with COVID and pandemics. But the agriculture transformation strategies, the green ones, of course, agro-industrialization, and creating more jobs and employment opportunities in agro-industrial, in rural areas is one measure. But the problem is, and of course, there are resources like in Sudan. That's going to be one strategic emphasis and direction that we are promoting here is, of course, for agro-industrialization, you need energy, intensive energy use. To have people have more jobs outside the production sector, the farming, downstream in the value chain. But Sudan is very rich, and many other countries, in renewable resources, especially solar. So we are trying to have emphasis on off-grid solar energies, and trying with a small pilot projects, applications to pumps for irrigation purposes, and for smaller agro-industrial, so smaller off-grid type of solar units. So renewable energy for rural electrification or rural energy, that would be one green option.
Great. Okay. Well, listen, I think we're about out of time. Thank everybody for participating actively in the discussion. Madhu, thanks very much for helping out here, and thank to Rashid for his coming in from Khartoum and being with us, and very strongly and sincere congratulations on the Boulding Award, and we hope to see you next year.